Good afternoon. Welcome to M.O.V.E Public Library. The library is celebrating 120 years of service in Mobile. And we are very proud to be able to host Mr. Ben Raines and the members on this Juneteenth. We thank you so very much for coming. M.O.V.E Public Library has had a history of connecting with the community. And the finding of the Clotilda has certainly connected Mobile to the international community. We are so proud to be a part of it. We are so proud that we have artifacts and information for him to do research in our local history genealogy division. And we've come a long way in Mobile. At one point, libraries in Mobile were segregated. But at this point, we have a branch named after Virginia Dillard Smith, who was the first African-American librarian in the state of Alabama. I can't say enough about how proud I am to work with M.O.V.E Public Library. And today's event, like I said, it's been very special. We've been planning it for a long time. We want to welcome Mr. Ben Raines, Mr. Darron, Patterson, Ms. Vickii Howell, and Joycelyn Davis. So at this time, our PR person, Ms. Valerie Longer, will come over and introduce Mr. Raines.
Good afternoon. We're so glad to have you all here with us for this Juneteenth weekend. Ben Raines is an environmental journalist, filmmaker, author, and charter captain who discovered the wreckage of the Clotilda. A longtime newspaper reporter, Raines has won more than 24 awards for his coverage of environmental issues and natural wonders in Alabama and on the Gulf Coast, and co-authored several peer-reviewed papers published in scientific journals. He wrote and directed The Underwater Forest, available for free on YouTube if you want to check out that documentary, an award-winning film about the exploration of a 70,000-year-old cypress forest found off the Alabama coast. Raines also wrote and produced the documentary America's Amazon, which is aired on PBS stations around the country and been distributed to public schools across Alabama. He's won many awards through all of his work. Ben is a graduate of New York University's Tisch School of Arts with a degree in filmmaking and is a U.S. Coast Guard licensed captain, giving tours of the Mobile Peninsula in Alabama's Barrier Islands. He lives with his wife and son in Fairhope, Alabama. Let's welcome Ben Raines to the stage for his presentation on his latest book, The Last Slave Ship, the true story of how Clotilda was found, her descendants, and an extraordinary wreck.
All right, thank you all so much. Let me get my water. I've known Valerie a long time. I've worked with the Alabama Coastal Foundation. That's where I encountered her first. That's why she mentioned the underwater forest and said you can see it on YouTube. That's who helped me secure the funding to make the film. So thank you for that. So I'm pleased we have our guests here. Darron and Joycelyn are both descendants, and Vickii Howell is one of the people who first focused on the need for us to celebrate African Town's history in that big museum and stuff like that. So we're going to talk to them a little after. I'm really happy to be here in the library because this library, the Mobile Library, played a key role in discovering the Clotilda. And as we go through the presentation, I will show you that perhaps the key clue that led me to the ship was found in the library's genealogy division, which is, I think, a block back. So we're going to talk about that. We're here for the Juneteenth. That's the occasion for us to be here today, which is, the national celebration of the end of enslavement. So we're going to go back and talk about the Clotilda story, and it's perfect for this occasion. The reason we're going to talk about the Clotilda, 110 people who were smuggled aboard into America, the last people who were enslaved, who arrived in the United States to be enslaved, is because this story is the origin story for the African diaspora globally, not just the African American diaspora. This is the story of anyone whose ancestors arrived in another country in the hold of the ship, whether that was in America, in the Caribbean, in South America. This is their story because it's the only story we've got. Out of the 12 million people who were enslaved, we know more about the people who arrived on the Clotilda than we know about anybody else. And it's not close. We know almost everything about the people who arrived on the Clotilda and almost nothing about the other 12 million people. Partly that comes down to when this happened. So slavery, of course, ended with the end of the Civil War. The Clotilda arrived about 6 months before the beginning of the Civil War. So the people on board were quite young. They were between 12 and about 30 years old. And so they lived for a really long time after the Civil War. And because of the notoriety of the Clotilda story, the perpetrators, Timothy Mayer and Captain Foster, particularly Timothy Mayer, ended up quite famous. He was interviewed over and over as the last slaver. The other component of the story that drew people here was Africatown, the city, the town created by the Clotilda's passage. Now, of course, we're only about 3 miles from Africatown right now. We all know a lot about it because it's one of our neighborhoods. But to the world at large, the story of Africatown had largely been forgotten. The story of the Clotilda, until a couple of women saved the story. So I want to give a little thanks to them. The first being a woman from Mobile named M.O.V.E, whose father owned the funeral home, the big funeral home here in Mobile. And she grew up with some of the Clotilda passengers, captives, working for her father after the end of slavery as gravers. So she knew them. And then later in her life, when she was an older woman, she was the person who encountered Cujo Lewis, the most famous of the Clotilda passengers, after he had been hit by a train downtown Mobile, actually about 2 blocks from where we are. He was in his wagon was hit by a train. M.O.V.E happened upon him, got him medical help. And this is a society woman. This was a very unusual thing for her to have done. Got him to a doctor, got him treated, and then went to his house and brought food and food after. And that led to her ultimately interviewing 10 of the people on the Clotilda while they were still alive in between 1912 and 1914, and publishing a book called Historical Sketches of the South. That book drew Zora Neale Hurston here, who then wrote her book, Barracoon, which we've had the privilege of reading now, but nobody did during Hurston's lifetime. The book was not published until 2018. It actually sat in the basement in an archive at Howard University with the rest of Hurston's papers, because she refused to let publishers in 1927 change the dialect she had applied to Cujo Jackson. And we learned a lot from that dialect these days. So she stuck to her guns. It meant her book was, not published until about 40 years after she died. And then 2 more women brought the story a new attention. Natalie Robertson, who interviewed as a PhD student, she came to Mobile. She was going to college somewhere, I think, in the Midwest. She came to Mobile and interviewed the last of the people who knew the Clotilda passengers, including some of their children. And her work helped draw Sylviane Diouf here, who wrote Dreams of Africa in Alabama, which was a really exhaustive scholarly work that traced where the Clotilda came from back to individual villages in Africa. When I mentioned we know more about these people, we literally know the villages they came from. We have the story from their mouths. We know what their lives were like. We know things about them we know about none of the other enslaved. So we know, for instance, Cujo, we have from his mouth the story of his life up to the time he was captured and everything that happened after. We know that he had 18 siblings, that they used to run through the forests and jungles around his home village of Bonte, smelling for fruit on the breeze, pineapples, oranges, bananas. We know how idyllic their life was. So we know what their life was like before they were enslaved. We know what happened during the incredibly brutal African slavery raid where they were captured. We know what happened to them once they were captured and marched to the barracoons, the slave prisons. We know what happened when they were purchased. We know about their voyage across the ocean, the Middle Passage. These are some of the only records in existence from people who were enslaved telling us these stories. So that's why this story is so important. Then we have the other component. We have the perspective of the white enslavers. We have from Captain Foster, who sailed across the ocean, his journal. So we know what his interactions were with the Dahomeyans, the tribe that captured everyone on the flotilla. And we have great insight into that side, the business side of this, and what an industrial undertaking this was in Africa where the people were captured. So that's why we're going to talk about the flotilla. We are going to see a lot of pictures, and I'm going to buzz through most of them quickly because I have a bunch, but I want you to really get a feel for the story and the places we're going to talk about. You know, the book title says An Extraordinary Reckoning. But what this story is really also about is a reconciliation. And we're going to talk a little more about that because that's what is really needed, both in this country and in Africa, in our two countries put together. So, switch slides. There we go. All right, so these are three of the Clotilda passengers. This is Cujo Lewis on the left. This is Charlie Lewis. So Charlie is actually Joycelyn's ancestor. Her family is from Lewis Quarters, which is one of the African neighborhoods that's surrounded by Gulf lumber. And then this is Peter Lee, Gulf, who was actually a member of the tribe that captured all the Clotilda people. And he was given to Captain Foster, who sailed to Africa, by the Dahomey prince he's dealing with as a gift. This was a member of the Dahomey royal family, and he was just handed over into slavery, taken away from his family and everything. Giving a little peek into the Dahomey regime, how ruthless they were. So this is Timothy Mayer. This is the guy who sent the ship to Africa. He did it because he wanted to thumb his nose at the federal government. So we're on the eve of civil war here. Timothy made a bet on his boat. We've all heard that the flotilla story began with a bet, and it did. The bet was made between Timothy and some of the other passengers on his boat who were Yankees. They were one from New York City, one was a pharmacist from Rhode Island. There were a handful of these Northerners on the boat. And they were talking about the news of the day, which was another ship called the Wanderer that came in Georgia with an illegal load of people the year before the flotilla. It had almost 400 people on it. Several of them actually ended up in M.O.V.E, the captives who were brought in there. So other Africans were enslaved in M.O.V.E. We know this because a New York Times reporter wrote about encountering them on the train in Montgomery. And then a Movidian was put on trial for having bought some of the Africans. So we know that there were other Africans that ended up in our community prior to the flotilla passengers. Their names and stories have been lost to history. They were not preserved the way these other ones were. But so Mayer's purpose was to thumb his nose at the government. One of his passengers talking about the story of the Wanderer, which was in the Mobile Register, was in the New York Times, was in the New York Tribune, and he covered all over the country from the courthouse in Georgia. And so the passenger says, well, I think they should hang the lot of them so that to scare the rest of them off from ever doing this. And Timothy says, nonsense, they'll hang nobody. And I'll bet you $1,000 I could do it myself inside a year, which he proceeds to do. Now, the reason Timothy was so bold about this is because no one had ever been hanged for illegal slavery. So slavery was still illegal up to the Civil War. But in 1808, Thomas Jefferson signed a law outlawing the importation of people to be enslaved in the United States. So the Atlantic trade was curtailed in 1808, except for these sort of illegal ventures that were still happening, bubbling along. Thousands of people were still being illegally imported into the country. But Mayer knew nobody was going to get in trouble because every president, between Thomas Jefferson and Abraham Lincoln, there are 9 of them, founding fathers like Adams and Jefferson. Every one of those 9 presidents pardoned convicted slavers, people who were caught red-handed, and they let them go. Abraham Lincoln became the first person to hang somebody for slavery. The person he hung was actually captured 3 weeks before the Clotilda arrived back in America. So this fellow very nearly had the news. He managed to escape it, but we'll talk about that a little more. So Timothy got home from this steamboat trip where he made this bet at $1,000, which in today's money is equivalent to about $30,000. There are lots of seats up here in the front. Well, not lots. There's a row here. You can tell you see. There's people coming in. So he knew exactly what he was going to do as soon as he got home. He went to his next door neighbor, this guy, Captain William Foster. So Foster was a shipbuilder, and he had about 5 ships he had built that he had in service in the Gulf of Mexico. They had something like 18 wheels. These ships would leave Alabama with a load of lumber, oak, live oak, yellow pine, and go to the Caribbean where they don't have trees like that for the most part, and sell a little bit over Mexico, and then come back with rum, oranges, sugar, things you could get in those places. And they were just traveling back and forth across the Gulf. One of his ships was the Clotilda, and this is what it would look like. This is a 2-masted schooner. The Clotilda was specially made for this kind of trade. It had a retractable keel, meaning a centerboard that hung down to give the ship stability in the open ocean. It could be pulled up in the shallow coastal waters. So the Clotilda only drew about 4 feet of water, which is pretty extraordinary for an 87-foot-long ship. That turned out to be one of the things that helped identify the ship positively when we found it, the fact that it had a keel. So a lot of the history books and some of those other historians I mentioned said that the Clotilda was built specifically for this trip. That's not true. Clotilda was built 5 years earlier, and it was not remotely like a slave ship, a purpose-built slave ship. You see those images where you see the ship with all the people laying like wood stacked, flat on their backs. There would be 4 or 5 layers in the ship. Those were purpose-built slave ships, and they were built to carry 1,000 or more captives at a time. The Clotilda, by contrast, was only 87 feet long. They could never carry that many people. Timothy just wanted to send the ship there, get enough people to his deck, because he already had plenty of enslaved people. He and his 3 brothers had 3 plantations, and they all together they enslaved about 50 people. They were multi-millionaires. Timothy arrived here in Alabama in 1835, right after Andrew Jackson killed and captured all the Indians, Native Americans in Alabama. You hear about the Trail of Tears, the people marched to Oklahoma. Those were Alabama natives. That's who was Trail of Tears, just so you know. And that opened Alabama to white settlement. Timothy, who's from Maine, was one of the people who came here. This was the frontier at that time. So Timothy and his 3 brothers went from being deckhands on a steamboat to 20 years later, the Clotilda time, they're multimillionaires with a fleet of 9 steamboats. Timothy had a habit of naming the steamboats after really, he gave them very provocative names. The ship that the bet was made on was called the Roger B. Taney, who was the Supreme Court Justice who authored the Dred Scott decision taking citizenship away from African Americans, whether they were enslaved or not. So Timothy celebrated this guy by naming the ship after. His last ship he built was called the Southern Republic because he was announcing his political preference. He wanted the South to be a new country. So we know what that is. So this is the license of the ship for a couple of reasons, but the only reason we're going to look at it is, you see over there where it says Clotilda with an A? That is the name of the ship. You notice the historic marker in downtown Mobile about the slave market says Clotilda, French spelling with the E on it. You notice the sign in Africatown, the mural painted on the side of the highway says Clotilda, French spelling. This comes down, I figured out, this maybe is the second most important thing that after finding the ship. A journalist made a mistake back in the 1800s, and he spelled the name of the ship wrong and it stuck. It was spelled properly in every account up to that guy, and then everybody after that spelled it wrong. So I apologize for all of us journalists. And you will see in a minute that I made a mistake of my own in this. So the Clotilda, where are we going to send? Where is Timothy going to send the ship to get captives? Well, luckily, the Mobile Press Register came to the rescue and published an article in 1860 announcing that a place in Africa called Ouida, the Dahoman Empire, had just reopened the slave trade. Now, Ouida was one of the 3 biggest slave ports on earth. But in 1858, the British talked, at the point of a gun, talked the Dahoman Empire into getting out of the trade in people. The British said, we will buy so much palm oil from you, you won't need to do this lucrative trade and do what you're doing. That lasted for about 2 years. This fellow, King Gizu, decided, you know what, I'm sick of this palm oil stuff. We're going to go catch the people and sell them. And so he got back into the slave business. There was an article in the Press Register that Timothy and Captain Foster read that said, Ouida is back open. people can be had for $60 a piece. Now, an enslaved person in Mobile at the time was about $2,000. In today's money, about $60,000. This was part of the reason for the Clotilda's trip, and part of what Timothy was protesting, because in the northern slave states where they weren't growing cotton, Maryland and Virginia, an enslaved person was about $500. So that with the Atlantic trade shut down, all the enslaved people, the new enslaved people they could bring to the table were people from up there. So the slave trade shifted from the Atlantic trade to a domestic trade. And so Timothy and people like him saw this as a tax on the South, that enslaved people cost so much more here. So that was why he was trying to do this trip. He funded other efforts to create a new slave state in Honduras, to take that country over and stuff like that. So this was not his only attempt at turning the South into a slave country again. So he says, all right, let's go to Ouida. Now, Ouida was notorious. Even in the 1600s, there was a Dutch slave trader who wrote a journal in 1619. It's called Diary of the Dutch Slave Trader, 1619. In it, he had this incredible sentence. He said, at most of the African slave ports, you could get 3 or 4 people in a week. At Ouida, you could get 1,000 people in a few hours. So the Dahomeyans, that's Ouida was the port of Dahomey, this capital in modern day Benin, industrialized the capture of people. Historians believe about 1/3 of all enslaved people came from through the port of Ouida. Now, to understand Dahomey, modern day Benin, it's good to think about Alabama. Benin, the country, is almost exactly the same size as Alabama. And the Dahomey Empire was almost exactly the same size as Baldwin County. So the way to think about this is for 300 years, the people of Baldwin County attacked the rest of Alabama and captured 4 million people and sold them. Now, one of the, well, we'll get to that in a second. This is these are both drawings incidentally by a British Commodore who visited Dahomey. And you notice that Gizu has a hatchet in his hand, symbolizing his power and all that. But look what he's wearing. These are European silks. You know, these are beautiful fabrics. You see the umbrella with all the tassels. You know, they were trading with all of Europe. Dahomey was an incredibly wealthy place. So this is where Captain Foster sailed. He talked about the luxury accommodations when he arrived. He was met on the beach and carried in a litter, you know, a hand borne by a bunch of people. He talked about how fine the sheets were, the liquor that he was served, all that stuff. This is all in his journal. This is one of the barracudas. Dahomey, the slave trade had become so organized there that all of the slavey nations, England, France, Portugal, Holland, Netherlands, had these purpose-built forts. Now, barracuda is a Spanish word that means port, but these are the slave prisons. The slave nations each had their own prison where the Dahomeyans would put people so that people from England or France or wherever could come by them without having to fuss with other languages and all that stuff. Just to give you an idea of how, when you think about that for a minute, you know, you have purpose-built prisons for each country that's coming to buy them. So by the time the Clotilda arrives there, this fellow has become king. This is King Gizu. King Glele, I'm sorry. This is Gizu's son. Glele, to give you a taste of his bloodlust. When his father died, the year after, he did a celebration, a custom, they call it. The Dahomey Empire is where voodoo was invented. Vodun, that's the religion. That's how voodoo got to Louisiana, got to the Caribbean, got to Brazil. It was in people captured by the Dahomeyans from modern day Benin and sold. So he had 250 people ritualistically slaughtered to celebrate his father's death. You know, the central tenets of the Vodun religion are ancestor worship, and then there's a lot of sacrifice. You hear Santiera and all that stuff. That's what this is all about. So Glele, the reason he had 250 people he could just have slaughtered is because every year the Dahomeyans would march with an army 50,000 people strong and go raid surrounding kingdoms. Before they attacked the kingdom, they would say, hey, we're going to give you a chance to give our great king half of all your crops. And if they said no, they'd say, well, you've insulted our king, we'll be back. And they would come back. Now imagine that, 50,000 people, that is a giant army. This is an army by the 1800s, well armed with English guns. Just like this Dahoman soldier. Maybe they notice, this is a woman. See her lipstick. I think the lipstick was added by the lithographer, not yet. But this is an Amazon warrior of Dahomey. The Dahomans had this elite unit of 5,000 women as part of their army. They were the Green Berets of the Dahoman army. And how did these women become warriors? Well, it happened because there was a Dahoman king who had a twin sister. And the king died unexpectedly. And the twin sister said, I think I'll be king. And so she made herself king and masqueraded as her brother. To keep her secret, she surrounded herself with a guard of women. And those women became fiercer and fiercer, and the guard grew. These became the most terrifying soldiers in the Dahoman army. You notice she's holding a head. So what ultimately evolved was the Dahoman army, made up mostly men, would go, let me show you this too. This is Black Panther, the warrior women of Wakanda. They are inspired by the Amazons. So these Amazon women would go, the men would surround the village. 45,000 male soldiers outside the village. The women would climb ladders. You see the big fortifications there? These were like walled compounds. Cujo Lewis's village had high walls and a bunch of gates all around it. It was a market town, Bonte. It's quite a big town, probably 10,000 more. So the women, with the dead of night, would scale ladders, climb over the walls into the villages, sneak all around the village, into people's houses. Cujo talks about the front door to his house didn't have hinges. You picked the door up, moved it aside to go in the house, and then you picked it up and put it back in front. So there was no lock. The women sneak into the village and start cutting people's heads off. And Cujo describes waking up in the night, in the dark, people bleeding and screaming everywhere. He actually talks about the smell of blood filling the streets. Now, this was done for several reasons. Of course, it terrified everybody in the dark. But they were also getting rid of the people they didn't want to enslave. Kids younger than 12 were killed. People older than 30 were killed. The Dahomans left no one behind in the villages they conquered because they didn't want anybody coming for revenge. And so the area around Dahomey was like a giant ghost town. All the villages that used to be there were now peopleless. And that was their ever-expanding frontier. They had this dead zone all around it. And part of that cutting off the head thing, in the Dahoman culture, you could not claim to have killed somebody unless you had their head legally done. Cujo talks about when they arrived back at the king's palace, when he was chained in the slave coffle and everything, the soldiers all put heads on top of their spears and marched down the street with the heads up on the spears. The Dahomans would make umbrella handles out of jawbones and things like that. King Glele had 42 skulls in his palace of other kings that he killed. He polished them and put them on display. And that's the empire. We know how feared the Dahomans were from some signs in the landscape of Benin today. And this is one of them. This is a village called Gandhi. Gandhi is a floating village. This is a city, it's still there today. In 1704, the Clotilda tribe knew they were about to get attacked. They were a small tribe. They also knew that the Dahomans would not cross water before battle. And so they knew if they moved out to the middle of the lake, they wouldn't be attacked because it was against the Vodun religion to cross water before battle. Many of their gods are sea serpents and snakes in the water and things, and so they didn't want to cross water. So these folks moved out there in 1704. They're still there today. There are 50,000 of them out there today. It's a giant village. It's spectacular. It's incredibly fun. This is what you see here where everybody's crowded around. They're getting the water. That's where they get water. This is actually a little drone footage I shot while I was there. But that's a hotel there in the corner. There are restaurants. Just incredible. And, I was on a charter boat that led us around, and I'm a charter captain. And I showed the guy my boat, people on it, and it was a lot of fun. There's some kids there. But what I want you to notice in this picture of the plants, if we haven't people spending time out in the Delta, you've seen this plant. This is water ice. This is actually an Amazonian plant that should not be in our Delta, but it is. So I'm there in this lake. You know, it's a coastal lake, just like the Delta. It's a brackish system. And I think, why are these Amazonian plants here? Well, then it hit me like a brick in the head because they've been trading with Brazil for 400 years. And that's probably why those plants are here. If you look at the scientific literature, they'll tell you this plant arrived in Alabama in about 1930. I think that's the first time a scientist who knew it didn't belong here saw it in Alabama. This is the school in Ghana. That's the school bus over there with all the kids on it. And you can see them in their uniforms. Incidentally, the school bus, they built the land so the kids had somewhere to play soccer.
Oh.
And then look at this. This kid is about 5 years old, paddling this 30-foot long canoe. And man, he was moving through there. Really, really something. All right, so now we're back to Cujo. This is sitting on his porch in Africa Town, in his house, which was right next to the Union Baptist Church, the brick church. His house was right next door. But you can't see it because the city of the state of Alabama tore it down in 1992 to build that road attached to that bridge. They expanded the road from 2 lanes, and they destroyed all the remaining houses built by the Clotilda passengers. That was the center of old Africa. That's where all the founders lived. When Cujo's house was torn down, his descendants were living in it. I interviewed that whole strip, that whole road was all the original families of the original settlers of Africa Town, and we destroyed their houses and scattered them to the wind. We'll talk more about that in a minute, but now we're with Cujo on his journey. This is the palace. After he was captured, Cujo ran out of the village and was tackled, chased by the wind, and he was tied up and he was crying and he told the guards, I need to go find my mother. I've got to find my mother. And they just laughed at him. He said they had no ears for crying. So then he and all the other people were marched to this palace. Along the way, talks about this in Vickii. The soldiers stopped and built a huge bonfire. They did this because all the heads they were carrying started stinking. And some of them had 3 and 4 heads, where they could put the rope up through the neck and out the mouth and had them on a string. And they smoked them to make them stop singing. And so Cujo and the others had to sit there and watch friends and relatives faces be disfigured in these horrible masks. You know, we talk about PTSD today and everything. Cujo, these things were as fresh in his mind when he died in his 90s as they were when he was 19, when he was captured. And he talked about them constantly and would break down in tears. Everyone who interviewed talked about it. So this palace, we marched a slave coffle there to interview all the captains. They asked them what they could do, what skills they had. If you had skills, they kept you. If you were a baker, an artist, something like that. If you were just a soldier, like Cujo, he was being trained as a warrior, you got sent away. So this is a Jahoman person, a Fawn person. That's the tribe today, Fawn. You see the facial scarification. These become very important in this story for a variety of reasons. Cujo and the other Africans had different facial scarifications, chipped teeth. Cujo, when he smiled, and clenched his teeth together, there was an oval on one side and another shape on the other, where his family had filed his teeth to make these shapes. And it's a way that people could recognize each other, which tribe they were. This still goes on today. And so now, the Fawn, the Jahomans, are the dominant ethnic group in Benin today. They're the largest ethnic group. All the other tribes, Yoruba and this whole suite of other tribes, were the tribes that were captured by the Jahomans. And so now they're having these rivalries between the tribes there. The government's worried it may break out civil war with all the other tribes that were captured coming after the Jahomans, the Fawn, the dominant ethnic group. The Fawn controlled all the levers of government. The president is Fawn and always has been, well, for the last many, many years. So this is the slave route. Cujo and 4 million people were marched down this road. It's 60 miles long. You can go walk down it today. There's coconut palms all along it. Mango trees. Mango trees there are like magnolias here. If you see a big, beautiful magnolia out in the field, that's how big a mango tree is. And it's covered with mangoes. People just walk down the street and grab them and eat them. really fascinating, the papaya trees and all that. This is the tree of remembering. This sign in French tells you that everybody who was sold, the Dahomeyans marched them around this tree 3 times so that their souls would know their way back home to Africa after they had been deported for the rest of their lives. And this gets back to the Dahomey ancestor worship. They didn't want these souls mad at them. They thought walking around this tree would somehow solve the problem. So after this, they were taken to the Barracudas. And we have 2 perspectives of the Barracudas. We have Cujo talking about it. And they could hear the ocean, but they couldn't see it. He'd never seen the ocean. And then we have Captain Foster's perspective. He describes in a lot of detail his visit to the Barracudas. We have a 12-page handwritten journal from Captain Foster, which I'm going to show you a piece of in a minute, where he tells us the white enslavers' perspective of going to Africa and what happened and what it was like and all that. He says he walked into the Barracuda and there were about 4,000 people naked waiting to be sold. So when I talk about the industrialization of capturing people and selling them, that's what they're, these people were essentially like cattle, feedlot, barn, waiting to be sold. So here's the Clotilda artist rendering. You can actually see part of what I'm talking about. The hold is very small. You're not carrying 1,000 people on this ship. In the Clotilda's case, the people were chained around the neck. They were naked. They were chained around the neck and chained to the floor in groups of 8. And this is how their crossing went. After almost 2 weeks, the captain got them out and had to walk around the deck. They were well away from land and everything. To exercise, and Cujo said that none of them could walk. It took them all a long time to get their legs back under them where they could walk because they'd been chained to the floor for 2 weeks. He talks about something else that is not in any of the history books. I read it in a newspaper article, in a newspaper interview he gave when he was about 85. It's the only place I've read this story, but he talks about one day, Captain Foster had them all brought up on deck, all chained together, and he chained each of their groups of 8 to the anchor, to the chain for that. And if you see Amistad, there's a scene just like this in the book. And this is something that the slavers would do. Once the trade was outlawed in England in 1835. And so England became this major force on earth, pushing for the abolition of slavery. And they stood up this anti-slavery squadron. And they bullied the U.S. and finally getting together and going along with it. But, the English were way ahead of us in this regard. So the anti-slavery squadron would come after these suspected slaving ships and give chase. So the ships would take all the people up on deck and chain to the anchor and cut the anchor rope. And the chain and the anchor would pull all the captives over, so there was no longer any proof that there was a slave ship. The fact that Cujo had this, it just, really stunning, kind of staggering. So Cujo, when he was enslaved, worked on one of Mare's steamboats. And that becomes important to his story. He described it as the hardest, most difficult part of his life. He talked about having to work so hard, and he did. The life of an enslaved person on a steamboat was brutal. Basically, when the boat was running, they had to be manning these giant pumps because the boats leaked horribly. To keep them from sinking, they had to do these pumps the whole time. As soon as they stopped somewhere, they all had to run ashore up into the woods and gather wood, bring back to feed the big ovens and the big boilers on the ship. And when you see a model of a steamboat, the Mississippi River Queen or something, there are all these neat stacks of wood on the boat. That's not how this went down. That's an artist's rendering. This is Cujo and his wife. And this is Cujo in his cabin. By the time Cujo was about 60, he had lost his wife and all 5 of his children. His children, his boys, 2 of his kids, I believe, died of yellow fever, just based on his descriptions of their deaths. His boys were murdered, and one of them was murdered by a sheriff. One of them ended up in the Alabama convict leasing system, where the state was able to keep slavery going until about the 1940s. After the end of slavery, at the end of the Civil War, Alabama said, what are we going to do with all these prisoners, particularly all these African-American prisoners, people who would get caught for whatever over the next 50 years. So they worked out a system with all the coal mine companies of leasing convicts to the coal mines. And it was just slavery by another name. And it actually literally went on in Alabama boards. Really, brutal. But in this picture, you see a couple of interesting things. You see his pots down there, his pots and pans. He cooks over the fire, and which is how they cooked in his homeland and everything. You see his snazzy boater hats over there on the wall. You see some pictures. We can't quite tell who they are. And then you see all the chairs with junk stacked on. Those are the chairs his family is no longer around the city. So Cujo could not read or write. He had memorized a lot of the Bible. This was the last 30 years of his life. He was alone in this cabin. And, he talks at various times to people who would come to interview him. He would talk about how happy he was to see somebody, to have a visit. And that house was the one that was torn down. So this is where I come into the story. We're going to talk about finding the ship. So I didn't know the ship was missing. I've been an investigative reporter here in Mobile for 17 years at this point, and never once thought of looking for the Clotilda because I didn't understand it was lost. I saw the mural. I knew the story only in the sense that I knew the last slave ship came here to Mobile. The last ship that brought enslaved people to America arrived in Mobile. That was as far as my knowledge of the story went. So one of my old colleagues at the paper, a guy named Jeff Newton, called me up. He said, "Hey, you should look for the Clotilda." And I said, "What is this?" And he told me the story. Well, the story is Clotilda comes back from Africa. And the plan was Timothy Mayer had a guy, he's going to have a guy on the coast watching for it down in Bayou Factory area, Point of Pines. And that guy, when the ship arrived, was going to come back to town and say, "Hey, boat's here, let's go." And then we can get the steamboat, go down, take all the people off of it, put them on the steamboat, and then the Clotilda was going to sail from Mexico, get some cargo, come back to the cargo, come into the port. Because, the ship has to register when it returns to the United States. So this was their plan. Timothy Mayer messed up the plan because he couldn't quit blabbing. The whole time the Clotilda was sailing Africa and back, 3 months, he was telling everybody what he was doing because he was so happy. He was saying, "Guess what I've sent the Clotilda to Africa for a week's swim." He blabbed about it so much, it was in the newspaper. And then it was in newspapers around the country because the newspapers back then worked by telegraph. So the story ran in other newspapers. Clotilda's gone to Africa for capitalism. So Timothy Mayer is being watched by the federal government. You can see the people watching. And it's a safe bet that his good friend Judge Johnson, who was the district judge, the federal court judge in Mobile, had tipped him off, "Hey, they're watching." We know they were good friends. The first steamboat Timothy Mayer built, he named Judge Johnson. So the ship comes back. Timothy's too scared to have a watcher down on the coast because he's afraid that'll, so he doesn't do anything. He just pretends like, "I don't know anything about the Clotilda." Foster arrives back in America. They're in Grand Bay, which is an actual bay, not just a city, but it's over there by Bayou Factory, Portugal Bay. They're anchored in Grand Bay. They're terrified that the forts, Fort Morgan and Fort Gaines, the federal soldiers there are going to steal somehow, and attack him. He waits for 3 days, and the steamboat never comes. He assumed when they drop the anchor, the plan didn't happen. So after 3 days, Foster has to get off the coast of the road ashore, walk to Bayou Factory, and borrow a horse, ride to Mobile. He pulls up at Timothy Mayer's house. He said, "We're here. What's going on?" So they go, Timothy gets up, it's Sunday, July 9th, I believe. They go to church and get one of Timothy's steamboat captains and 2 of his brothers. They get on a steamboat and they go down to the Clotilda to get the people. Several things ensued. There was another mutiny and all that stuff. But they eventually get the ship in tow. The deal Foster made was Timothy Mayer was going to give him $35,000 for sailing to Africa and becoming a pirate, doing an illegal hanging crime. And he was going to give him 10 of the captains worth another $500,000. So Foster was going to go from living in a rooming house to be a millionaire for doing this. So when Timothy meets him down there with the boat, he says, "Hey, change of plans. We're taking," and he was going to get to keep the Clotilda worth another $500,000. He said, "We're taking the Clotilda up to the swamp and we're going to burn it. The heat is on. We can't have the ship and know what we've done. We've got to disappear the ship." And Foster's angry about this, but that's what happens. So they take the ship up there and they burn it somewhere in the Delta. And they take all the slaves and they put them on a steamboat and they take them upriver to Timothy's, one of his conspirators' plantations. Once again, he's done so much blabbing that 2 days later, this is the press register. The press register writes an editorial congratulating whoever is behind the journey of the Clotilda. The press register article knew there were 110 captives and knew they had been taken upriver on steamboat. So the feds go looking for it. Now, Timothy Mayor's family tells this story about how Timothy outsmarted the feds, that the federal agents were getting ready on another steamboat at the port of downtown Mobile to go look for the Clotilda. And Timothy's story is that he got the crew so drunk that the feds had to go find another crew. And this gave Timothy enough time to make all this happen, disappear in Apple's phone. Don't believe a word. Timothy Mayor got off for all of this stuff because of Judge Johnson, his best friend. In fact, Timothy Mayor got arrested the first week after the Clotilda arrived back. And he had to go to court because he accused of illegal slavery. And Judge Johnson snapped his fingers and said, no, I believe you didn't do this. Timothy was here in the country the whole time. That was his argument. So Judge Johnson lets him go. He's a good friend to have. We know Judge Johnson's political views because when the Civil War started, the next day he quit being a U.S. District Court judge and became one of the first Confederate District Court judges. So he was into Timothy's plan all along. So the ship was missing for 160 years. A number of people have looked for it, starting with the federal government. And then, Clive Cussler, the novelist who found the Hunter, he wanted to come here and look for it. The state wouldn't let him. They refused to let him because they were letting this guy, Mobility, Jack Friend, who's a local historian, a great guy, something really eccentric. Jack spent tens of thousands of dollars looking for the Clotilda, searching up in the Delta. So for the 30 years after the Clotilda trip, Timothy Mayor was here in town. I mentioned he was treated as this swashbuckling hero by the national media. He was interviewed over and over and over, and they would ask him about the Clotilda story. And every time he would tell it a little bit different, with a different location where they burned the ship up in the Delta. And that's what Jack spent his money with. He was going to look at all the places Timothy said the ship was burned. Well, so I'm doing my research after, when Jeff told me to look for it, I actually said to him, Jeff, that's ridiculous. That's like looking for a pirate train. But as soon as we got off the phone, I typed Clotilda in Google, ordered all the relevant history books, and started doing my research. And I ultimately found the key clue here in the library. This is it on screen. This is a page out of Foster's journal. So for 30 years, Timothy Mayor is celebrated as the last slaver, and it's driving Foster nuts because he's getting no credit. Foster got chased by the anti-slavery squadron 3 times on the journey. He got double-crossed by the Dahomans, and he had his crew mutiny 4 times. So he had, a harrowing journey, and Timothy's the one getting all the credit. So he wrote this thing called The Last Slaver. It's 12 pages, handwritten just like this, telling the whole story. He also tells the story of what he did with the ship. He never mentions Timothy Mayor. He talks about my slaves, my ship, and so here he says, I got a steam tug to tow my schooner up the Spanish River to the Alabama River at 12 Mile Island. Ooh, we have a location. Now I had another source telling me 12 Mile Island, who was a local mobility, Russell Lack. Russell grew up with Timothy Mayor's great grandsons. And Russell's father was lifelong friends with Timothy Mayor's grandson, not his great grandson. So they knew the families intimately, and both families owned a lot of property of the Delta. So I called Russell. Russell died just a few months ago. It's a great champion of the Delta. Called Russell and I said, Russell, you know where the Clotilda is? And he said, well, Dad, I said it was at 12 Mile Island. So I had Russell saying 12 Mile Island, and now I have him saying 12 Mile Island. Incidentally, he says, I sent them up in the canebrake to hide them until further disposal. I then burned my schooner to the water's edge and sunk her. And we're still at 12 Mile Island. So that was my first tip. And then I had another clue I found in a newspaper article. These other historians, that's not being newspaper reporters, they didn't care about looking at newspapers, but there's a lot in it. I found another Cujo interview. And in it, he says 12 Mile Island was where the ship was burned. Now, of course, he wouldn't have known that. But then he worked on Steamboat for 5 years. And there was another key there that told him Cujo knew where it was. And that was James Denison. James Denison was a Cherokee Indian enslaved by the Bears. And he had been taught to drive steamboats. And he drove the steamboat that took the captives up into the Delta. He was there that night. Well, he and Cujo knew each other for the rest of their lives because James married one of the Africans and lived actually a few blocks from where we are right now. Incidentally, his wife, Kanko, is quite famous in family history. They raised pigs, and she was famous for her pigs and milk and stuff. And so a deputy came because there was a goat that kept getting out, and he was telling her he was going to take the goat. And she said, "No, you're not." And she picked him up and threw the deputy over the fence. So Kanko was a formidable woman. So I had a look at, well, I waited, I started my research in August of 2017. That's when Jeff called me and said, "Go look for the Clotilda," and I said, "That's nuts." So I was waiting because every year in the wintertime, we get these super low tides. And I was waiting for that because they usually come in January. So sure enough, January 2nd, we had incredibly low tide. It's 25 degrees. This is 2018. And I went up here 12 mile an hour and I saw this. So the normal water level is up where you see the reeds. The water level this day was about 3 feet lower than normal. You know those winter days when the water's all flowing out of the bay and you see those huge mud flats? This was a day like that. And I went up there and I found the ship at 12 mile an hour. And it was a schooner. And it was from the 1850s. And you can tell from construction techniques and things. So then I brought 3 archaeologists from the University of West Florida who were ship experts. They had found 12 Spanish galleons in Pensacola Bay. So they came and said, "Yeah, this is a schooner from the 1850s, and the width is exactly right." You couldn't tell how long it was. It disappeared into the river in the mud. And as I mentioned, it was 25 degrees. So then I brought a shipwright who specialized in construction techniques of old wooden sailing ships, and he verified all the different techniques you would expect. And a key point, there were no nuts, no bolts, no screws, because those things were not invented yet in commercial industrial scale. So these ships back in the 1850s were made with giant nails. And so we had a ship from the 1850s. So I wrote a story that the headline was "Wreck Found by Reporter May Be the Last Slave Ship." And the story went viral, nationally, internationally, the first day. By all kinds of media outlets and stuff. It was very exciting. I went and spoke in African Town. The people were so excited. They were talking about building a museum. They were talking about how this was going to, this proved their story was true and all this. And so then about 2.5 months later, a team of archaeologists came to town to study the ship. They waited until the water got warmer in March. And I was up there with them and everything. And, I had to write this story after their visit. Wreck found that the reporter's not the closer. So, as a reporter, I pride myself on not having corrections. So I've done a lot of big investigative stories, and I try and button everything in. And here on the biggest story I've ever done, my senior premises. So at this meeting, they explain all the reasons it's not Clotilda. And actually, some of the descendants in the media didn't believe the archaeologists in the state and were saying it's Clotilda, they're lying to us. They've always lied to us. And I had to say, yes, they've always lied to me, but this time they're not. It's not that. I knew how far the story had spread around the world. It's 2 days after the Clotilda story. The ambassador of Benin arrived here in Mobile, wanted me to take him up the river. I actually learned this from a woman I had never met, Sharon Group. Not here with us today, but she was sending me these crazy texts. I don't know how she got my number, but like, I have the ambassador call me. And, I was actually at the Point Clear Rotary Club at the Grand Hotel, doing a Rotary Club breakfast actually about amazing voices. My phone just started going off with these messages. I have the ambassador. So then I noticed her thing has a state seal on it. So I actually called her back, and sure enough, the ambassador of Benin is here. President Benin is sent him here to do a vote ceremony up at the site. And so I take him up there. And we go, and he's got a bottle of gin, this guy in a 3D suit, Armani sunglasses. And he brings the gin and spewing it out, and then doing his incantation in the fall. And they get more and more aggressive. And then tears start coming from behind his glasses. And then he's yelling. And this is a fawn. I can't understand a word he's saying. So then he stops and he says, I'm so sad. Can we please leave? So we leave. That night, I go to dinner with him. And he says, I'm going to tell you what happened up the river. I said, okay. He says, I am a prince of Dahomey. Lele was, I think he was his great-great-grandfather, or one or two greats. Said, my father, I am a prince of Dahomey. I am a Dahomey. My father's people did this to these people. My mother is Yoruba. Cujo was Yoruba tribe is one of the tribes. Actually, he says, I was begging my mother's people to forgive my father's people. And so I mentioned this tribal resentment going on there. Here it is in this one man, and it's brought into tears there on the river. So, you know, I see this to much bigger than I understood at the time. I was just a guy trying to solve a mystery when this all started. I did not understand the importance of the hotel. So I walked out of this meeting where they just explained why this ship is not my ship. And one of the descendants grabs me, this woman, Thelma Maiden Owens, and she gives me a big hug. And while she's hugging me, she starts singing my ear. And she sings this gospel song. It's called There's a Bright Side. The lyrics are, there's a bright side somewhere. Don't stop until you find it. And she pushes me back, holds me, looks me in the eye, says, don't give up then. Keep looking. You're going to find it. Don't stop. I felt this sort of electric charge force through me. It's kind of like, you know, she's. And my plan at that moment was to go home and get drunk. Not look for Clotilda anymore. And I turned away from her and walked to me. And these two men came up to me, and they were marine archaeologists. They told me they'd been hired by the state of Alabama to go up the M.O.V.E River and find two Confederate ironclads that were intentionally sunk as M.O.V.E fell. And the reason they were sunk is because ironclads, this is the ship encased in iron and metal, were notoriously slow. And so Union Navy ships were coming up the river after them. So the captains scuttled them and sunk them to keep them out of the Union hands. So these guys have been hired by the state because the state wants to raise them and put them on display. So they tell me, well, we found the two ironclads right away. You know, they were right by the Spanish River. So then we had 5 days of ship time paid for. So we decided to look for Clotilda. So we looked everywhere in the river up to the south end of 12 Mile Island. And I had this moment, I thought, I know exactly what I'm looking for. So when you look for a ship or something underwater, and I learned this in underwater forest stuff, we use several very expensive devices. A side scan sonar that looks and paints a picture of what's on the river bottom, sub-bottom profiler, which looks under the bottom, and a magnetometer that looks for the metal on the ship. As I mentioned, the ships were made with nails this big. You know, they're like railroad spikes, the giant handmade blacksmith. You know, so an old ship really lights up with metal, even though it's made of wood. And these guys use that stuff south of 12 Mile. Well, our eccentric M.O.V.E historian, Jack Frank, had looked everywhere across 12 Mile. He started his search at Bayou Canal, which is just above 12 Mile Island. And one of the places in Mayor City burned the ship, in addition to Bayou Corn, and it was a whole bunch of places. So I thought, okay, nobody has ever looked at 12 Mile Island. And I've got two guys who were there that night saying the ship's at 12 Mile Island. So I called Monty Graham, who was at the time the head of marine sciences at the University of Southern Mississippi, because I knew they had a survey boat, because they trained students to work in the oil industry. We use all those devices I mentioned to look on the seafloor when they're locating this place for an oil or a gas. So I called Bonnie because I knew he had one of these boats. And you know, these boats are very expensive. The machinery I'm talking about, each one of those devices can cost $250,000. So I said, Bonnie, you can to rent one of those boats. It's like $10,000 a day. So I called him and said, Bonnie, would you bring your big boat over here and help me look for the hotel? And he said, okay, what's your budget? And I absolutely no money. And he laughed and he said, okay, we'll do it. So he said he wanted to help African town and it would be good practice for the students. So he came over here with about 9 students and a couple of professors on the boat, and we went up the river and we surveyed 12 Mile Island area. It's about a 2-mile long piece of river. And we towed these machines up and down the river like mowing the lawn. They literally call it mowing the lawn. So you cover every bit of the river. Then they went back to the lab for a week, and it takes that long to collate all the data. Machines are feeding in on the M.O.V.E to 4 different laptops. And that, the data stream is really massive. And then they take this picture, they make a chart. You know what a topographic map looks like? Well, circles showing elevation. Well, these seafloor maps use color to show different depths. So we had this beautiful yellow and orange map and all. Next week, we go back out. This is 2 weeks after the meeting in African where they said, yeah, that's not. So this is April 9th, maybe something like that. And we're out there and we had 11 things that they highlighted on the survey chart that might be Clotilda. So we went and started checking. And one of them, first one we checked was really tantalizing. You could see the hatches in the deck, you could see the planks, you could see where planks were missing. It was exactly 90 feet long and about 27 feet wide. These are the Clotilda's dimensions. We were sure this was it. It was only about 100 yards downstream from the first ship. It was now moving deeper water. So we get in the water and there's the deck made of wood and the entire hull was made of iron. It's a ridiculous Edwardian era ship they made for a very short period of time because they sank. So, this was right at the transition between steamboat sail power. So they made some of these iron hull sailboats, but we stumbled upon this rare ship, but it was not the rare ship we wrote. So we looked at everything and ruled everything out and we did find it. And it's the end of the day. And I was pretty dejected. Everybody's packing up the dive gear. And I started looking at the chart on my phone. And we brought a guy who owns a dive shop, a dive safety manager. And he was looking over my shoulder. And he points at something on the chart. He says, "What's that?" I said, "Well, it looks like a shoe." What does it look like a shoe? It's the shape of a shoe. He said, "Not to me, that looks like a ship. Let's get the coordinates and go to that." So we call back to the lab and assistant. Monty talks them through finding the shoe, and then we go to the shoe. And I get the water. Nobody else gets in. It's cold. It's the end of the day. Putting on a cold wetsuit and getting into 55-degree river water is not cool. So I'm in the water. I'm pulling up all these logs. So moving them out of the way. The guys are laughing at me about firewood and stuff like that. And then I went underwater and I came up with this. And this was the first piece of Clotilda to see the light of day in 160 years. I felt it underwater, and I could tell it wasn't round like a log or stick. It was squared off. It was cut. I pulled it. Just got nails. This is a handmade blacksmith nail. Those lines in it, that's where they fold the metal and beat it. If you've ever watched a blacksmith work. And it had been burned, just like the Clotilda. So we called the state of Alabama. Told them we had found another ship from the 1850s, and it was the only thing in the Mobile River that could possibly be a Clotilda. And the lab that told us the dimensions were exactly right once again. This is mine. I'm just going to give him a little shout out. And you see the giant nail sticking out, right? And we're going to see the Clotilda here. You're going to see it come into frame in that top left corner. You see the back. You see 2 sides of the ship. This is not like that. This was about 3 weeks ago. So it's still there. Okay. So what I want to do is point at the spot where the people were. So here, this side, the people were right here. That's the area we saw in that other picture. As well. It's laying there on the river bottom. We know from the recent archaeological work, which comes 4 years after I found the ship, that the hull is intact and very sound. The wood, when they brought a small piece up and cut it, sap came out. So anybody who tells you the ship cannot be dug up is not telling you the truth. The ship can be dug up. The wood is sound. This is ready to go. When I did the work in the underwater forest, we had the same experience. Wood that had been buried was like it came off a tree yesterday. At bark, when we cut the 70,000-year-old wood, sap came out. Same thing's going on with the ship. What happens in the marine environment, you have about 6 inches of mud over something. It is protected from decay because there's no oxygen. No oxygen, no decay. So the ship is full of mud. It's okay. Not decaying. We're going to be able to dig it up. We had a huge celebration in Africa town. Incidentally, I'm pointing George Broder over there. He's one of the people who taught me that once you have about 6 inches of mud, he's the former director of CLAM. So, hello, George. This is the big party in Africa town when the ship's discovery was announced, and it was so much fun. People were dancing, they were wearing shirts that said our ship is coming in. A great. In fact, Joycelyn's in the picture, in the yellow right there. I'm over there, I'm looking in the very corner, the second guy from the end. I'm looking away, but I recognize my shirt. We had this great event. It was so powerful to me to see what the ship meant to the community. And it really brought home how significant finding the ship is, what it means. Now the story is complete. And now, we have the whole story. We have the story of all the people who were on it, and we have the ship. There is nothing else like it in world history. There is nothing else that can tell the story of enslavement the way Mobile, Alabama, and Africa tell. Wow. So this fellow showed up shortly after. The ambassador I mentioned told me that if this turns out to be Clotilda, someone very much more important for my country is going to come. And this is him. This man is essentially the Pope of voodoo. And he will describe himself that way. He is the senior Vodun official on earth, as his father was before him. It's Darron. Wonderful man. His business card tells you he's the king of oceans and seas. He's also a lawyer and a labor official. So quite this is his wife, Queen Mother, and this is Professor Petway from the University of South Alabama. And he wanted to go up the river to the site to do a new ceremony. This did not involve gin. But we went up there. He loved the rice along the riverbanks because they have rice and meat. And tied all these knots in the rice. He had handfuls of shells from Benin that he passed on the deck of my boat, and he would arrange them in lines, pick them up in certain orders. There's the whole thing. He named me a son of the sea and put a necklace around me. I wish I brought the necklace. We took one of the ones and wear it off and put it around my neck. And he told me two things. The first, people are going to be very mad at you for what you've done, exposing this. There are people who are going to hate that this has been exposed, and they're going to come after you. They have a gun. Don't worry, they won't fire. So I thought, cool. You're also going to find something else, something even more valuable, and you don't have to look for it. So I've been not looking for it ever since. And he told me a really interesting story about Cujo. He said, Cujo, I don't think we have this. Now we know his name in Africa is Kosovo. You see the bar in the base called Kuzulas, but it's actually Kosovo, that was his name. He says, Cujo, in our language, means a child born on Monday. He says, we know Cujo knew all the parables. He was famous in Africa town for telling African parables. And he was. He says, anybody who knows those parables and is a storyteller in the African tradition is not going to come to America having been enslaved, changed its name to I was born on Monday. He said, I think his name means something different. In our language, Ku means death, and Jo means reborn. I think he was saying with his name, Kosovo is dead, and I am reborn. Which makes a lot more sense than I was born on Monday. And he just said, I think because he couldn't write. He could write, he just got his name wrong. So he invited me to come to the meeting, and I went. And the ambassador, when he was here, the week before he arrived, he was here in January. The week before he arrived was when Donald Trump made the, S-House country comment, or S-Hole country comment. He was specifically talking about the meeting. The ambassador was in the White House waiting to go in and talk to it with a group of other African leaders. He knows he's talking about it. So when I got to the airport, the customs guy, I'm next in line, and I get up there, he looks at my passport, he says 8,000 feet. I say, we. He says, Trump. And I did this. He says, Beyond Bamu wants to meet. So other interesting experiences. I were in a nightclub, and the people figured out I was American. I don't know. Started chanting Obama. It was quite a scene. So this is the pool on the roof of my hotel in downtown Clotilda, a city of about 750,000 people. And this is the view over the edge of the balcony. So M.O.V.E is by far the biggest and most developed city in England. But you see that it's a mix of architecture and styles and everything. It's very much third world, but it's kind of a place. Food was delicious. This is a guy's clothing shop. I bought a bunch of clothes from him, and he told me that he was giving me them to say, this is the right size, you don't need to worry. I got home and they were all like for kids. This is a gas station. I did not see a gas pump the whole time I was there. The big bottles are for cars, the little bottles are for motorcycles. This is a traffic scene. The yellow shirted guys are taxis. So when you see guys yellow shirt with the passenger, that's somebody on a taxi. Traffic was, wild. It was brilliant. It was fascinating to walk around. Incredible art, like hanging on the buildings. This is this woman's advertisement for her hair salon. You see the woman with the basket on her head. Something that was talked about in Mobile, and maybe some of you in the room know it, was women walking around from Africa Town with baskets on them. And I had talked to a lot of people whose mothers would buy, vegetables from the women. And they were the Clotilda women walking to town from Africa Town to sell vegetables. The Clotilda women were also very famous for the food they sold. They would go to different factories like the sawmill, the gunpowder factory, and they would sell lunches to the workers there. I'll talk about that in a second more. This is M.O.V.E. This is another town some of the Clotilda passengers came from. It's a market town. So, and this tree stood where the house was, where people paid for the captives they bought. And so Foster was actually in the house at this spot when Joe was taken off the coffle, the line of slaves. There were 125 captives about to go on the Clotilda. And somebody came and untied Joe and pushed him under the house, like in a crawl space under the house, and told him to stay there and walked off. And Cujo watched as all the people that he was chained up with were marched away. And he stayed up at the house for about 10 minutes. And then he could hear the ocean. He wanted to see it because they hadn't been able to see it. And so he climbed up and peered over a wall. And he could see the ocean. He said, I wanted to hear what's making that roll. But then he sees the people he was tied up with down on the beach. And he sees his friend Keith, who's from his village. And he calls out, hey, don't forget me. And he calls him. He doesn't want to be alone. He wants to go with Keith. He might have been able to run away, be free, but he knew everyone in his village had been murdered. And so he made that choice at that moment to get on the boat and keep. This is John Smith, Mayor Fisher. He is buried in he's in WEDA, the museum there. They talk about him as a great man. He was on television in the a number of times. He organized festivals here and in the 1980s because he wanted to reconnect Clotilda past to their homeland, their descendants. You can see that back in the 80s that was what needed to happen. He actually put on a celebration in 1986. Jesse Jackson came. Dick Gregory came. These are luminaries in the civil rights world. You see art of this all over the. These are all the symbols of the kings of the era of slavery, the Dahomey kings who killed everybody and murdered everybody. And they're being celebrated on this wall. The Fawn still revered them and celebrated them as their historical kings. This is some of the photo art. You see things like this around, but then you see things like this. This is the door of no return. Look at the art. These people are bound. They're naked. They're on their knees. Can you imagine this in a public park in Mobile, anywhere in America? Dagbo, the Pope of Voodoo, told me, he said, I'm so proud of my country. We're not hiding things. We know we did this. There are people who want to hide us, but we're not. We're owning up to it. We're embracing it. These are just public art you see riding around town. And you see things like this. This is to represent all the people lost into slavery. Faceless. I mentioned how the Romans killed everyone in the village. So they were taking about a third of the population. They were killing about 2/3 of the population of every village. We talk about the 12 million people who were enslaved. We have no idea how many people were murdered through this. All crap. We're talking tens of millions of people more. It's kind of this unknown and unknowable cost of slavery, and what it must have done to the continent trying to recover from it. Having so much of its human treasure stolen. We see statues like this, which are meant to shame the farm, the homes, for their role in slavery, looking down in a way. And then statues like this, liberation. So this fellow here, the suit with the tie on, is Mayor Glaven. He is also a descendant of King Glaven, and he is the mayor of Lavona, where Glaven was the king of Lavona. So he put on a great meal for us. He wanted to talk about Clotilda, how I found it, and tell me, their side of the story. What he really wanted to do was ask me to make sure they had a piece of the Clotilda to put in the museum. But we got terribly drunk on his homemade pineapple whiskey. In this picture, the fellow in the dark blue and the guy next to it, this is the Minister of Interior and the Minister of Defense. One is in the tribe that captured, one's in the tribe, a tribe that was captured. It's right there in the government. Oh, incidentally, the other white face there, I saw 12 white people the whole time I was in the meeting for 2 weeks. Now, I've been to Kenya and Egypt and stuff, and white people are literally down the nose. They're everywhere. It's not like that in the meeting. It was really, that country, I think, is right for, they really want to embrace people coming home to see where their ancestors were from. And I think, I hope it happens. I mentioned this white guy, that's my best friend since childhood. I actually just visited in California. He worked as a relief driver for the Red Cross in the Rwandan genocide. And so I figured he had good survival skills. So I invited him to come with me. We won't talk about Python's temple. We won't talk about this. We'll talk about this. This is King Glele today. He is the king of the Dahomey Empire today. He is the grandson of the King Glele who sold people on the Clotilda. That's how recent this is. This is that guy's grandson, not great, his grandson. Quite amazing. We're in his palace. I did ask him, he came in and we had to sit on the floor. Actually, you have to crawl on your hands and knees into the room. The Romans know the reputation. So we do this, and we all sit around him on the floor, and everyone's given a glass of wine. And in Africa, you're told not to drink water unless you see it come out of a plastic bottle. And the Africans typically don't drink water unless it comes out of a plastic bottle. And so they were pouring this water out of the kitchen. And this moment, I want to drink that wine. But I knew the Dahomey tradition. If water is served at the beginning of a meeting, it means no treachery will happen. And so I thought, this is a good sign, and I'm going to drink the water. And then we drank Johnny Walker Blackberry. Everybody was having a good time and everything. And I asked him, I said, so I want to know, is it true? And he says, it's what true? I said, is it good to be king? And he laughed and said, yes, it's very good to be king. He's actually still in the palace. So here we are at God's house. That's an elephant skull down here. And you can see some little wooden statues on it that he's going to, there's all these bowls of herbs and everything. It's fascinating. I'm going to not really do much of that. This is his yard. He's painted on the side of the building. The government, the Benin, does this for their figures, like the kings of all the different provinces are still treated as basically religious figures. So they all have their pictures painted on the house. And I want to circle back to the food real quick. I mentioned The African women were famous for the food they sold here in Oakland. But what they were selling was stew. That's what people call them. They were famous for their stews. They made these really hearty stews. So in Benin, that's where black eyed peas come from. That's where okra comes from. The word for okra in Benin is gumbo. The women were selling gumbo. When we hear about things coming from Africa in the bodies of enslaved people, we're seeing it happening with the Clotilda people in real time. We have descriptions of the dances they did when someone died, the songs they sang. We have Americans who were there, and these were enslaved Americans, but born in America, talking about, I have no idea what they were saying, but it was the saddest thing I've ever heard in my life about the songs they were singing. When John Lee Hooker sings about Mojo Head, straight out of it, that's Mojo. They make that stuff that Dr. has. He makes the little pouches. He makes these people little pouches and hangs them over their shoulders. I wish I had a picture of one. It's a little, Mojo. So in this picture are all the ingredients for gumbo in a market. The food there was exquisite. This is a blackened trout. Just like a blackened redfish, but I guarantee they did not get the recipe from K. Paul's. This was a fiery hot tomato jelly, yams, the white stuff is yams and they're pounded into the paste. And then the chicken. The mayor, when he served me this dish, said, our chickens ride bicycles. And I was puzzled, And so during the course of the conversation, I learned that poulet secret is kind of a national dish there. And it is free-range chickens. They have farm-raised chickens, but when you go to a restaurant, they ask you what you want. You want poulet secret, or you want the farm chicken. And if you want the farm chicken, that's maybe, I have to say, the poulet secret is better, for sure. Peppers, they're really spicy food. When the ambassador came here, we went to Felix's, and he ordered spicy fish. He said it would be hot. I said, yeah. He said, okay, I want it hot. So they come and takes a bite and said, this is hot. Also, later, they said, the waiter comes back with a bowl of black pepper. And the ambassador said, no, cayenne. Bring me a bowl of cayenne. The waiter says, you want a bowl of cayenne? The ambassador said, yes, please. He brings a bowl of cayenne pepper. It's like a third of a cup. The ambassador pours it on his little piece of fish and eats it. Tears are streaming down his face. And he says, I thought we had gotten cold on the boat. I want to burn it out. This is the art. Benin's art is world famous. The Benin bronzes. This piece of art was made in the 1600s. It's exquisite detail on the chameleon. It looks like a living chameleon. Scales, everything. All the art was stolen by the French when they conquered Darron in 1892. And the French had just announced they're giving it all back. And this is world-class art. The French also announced they're going to fund the building of 2 museums in Eden, $25 million apiece, with our Smithsonian Institute. That's who's going to go help design the museums. Meanwhile, in Africa, we don't have a museum. What we have is a community that has been destroyed by industrialization and road. So this is basically Africa Town here. Downtown Mobile, sitting over here. Zoom in a little bit, and you can see the road right there. That road until 1992 was a 2-lane road with a 2-lane drawbridge. When they built this giant bridge, the community was misled. They did not understand the bridge, the approaches to the bridge. All those tank farms by the river, people live there. It's now all tank farms and all that. In this picture, these blue areas, these are all properties that were owned by African families, and their houses were all torn down, just in this little area. So this is, you can tell that the story, the cemetery, this is what we just talked about. Even the steep is the graves of his wife and children across the border, and the ornaments. His descendants are still living in the house. I talked to them about people in the 60s, 70s, and 80s still coming to the house to get tribal remedies from Cujo's granddaughter, who had learned these skills from Cujo. And all that was lost. The red areas are places where the Mayer family owned the land. And in 1968, tore down 500 houses they had built in Africa. And he did this to punish finally getting water service from the city of M.O.V.E. The Timothy Mayer's grandson, Augustine, was quoted in a newspaper saying, well, they won't be able to pay my $4 a month rent if they have to pay a water bill as well. So we're just going to tear the houses down. They lived there perfectly happy and healthy for 100 years without water. They don't need it. If you give them a bathtub, you wouldn't know what to do with it. He'd probably store food in it. This is literally what he said in a newspaper interview in 1968. And then they tore down 500 houses. Now, in a community of 12,000 people, you take 500 houses. You're talking about a lot of people removed from the equation. And then they sold their property to industry more and more. This is the last thing in Africatown built by the Africans that we know for sure they built. I think there are a couple of other things. I think there's some houses on Cujo's property that he may have helped build for his sons. And I got talking to John Sledge, our city architectural historian, about that. But this is Gulf. He was the one on the farm on that side when I showed you those pictures in the beginning. He's the one who was given this gift by the prince to Captain Foster. And Cujo and his sons probably made these bricks. They had learned how to make bricks. So it brings us to here. The big green circle is the old Hampton Housing Project. And we want to put a museum there. And this is, Vickii came up with this location. And it's 42 acres. We could put a museum there. She suggested a performance theater. We could have a ship in the museum. We could have a lake with a replica of the ship in it. We could have a commercial district to replace the one that was destroyed by the road. That's kind of where we are. Now, this is not necessarily the name of the museum, but this is what the museum will be. The National Monument to the Enslaved. Because we don't have one. And what better place for it than here in Africatown, in M.O.V.E, where we can tell this story like no one else can. So my last slide. That's Darron Patterson, right here. He's in the room. He's about to be up here on the stage. Darron is a descendant of M.O.V.E, and I'm going to let him tell you some of his unique history. That's Gary Lumbers in the middle. Gary is a descendant of Cujo Lewis, who's living in Cujo's house when it's farmed in. And that's Mike Foster, who is a descendant of Captain Foster. And this picture was taken because they all wanted to go up to the ship one day after the Founders Day celebration. And I said I'd keep them on my boat. And we got up there. And I had this epiphany, and I said, guys, this is the first time an Allen, a Lewis, and a Foster have been here together since the night the ship was parked. And they all had a big hug. And Darron said to me later, you know, Mike and I, we're going to go to the evening and see if maybe seeing us there, the descendant of a slave, enslaved person, and descendant of his enslaver, seeing us laughing and hugging, maybe that can help them feel too. So that's the end of this part of the talk. Now we're going to bring our guests up on stage and ask them questions and stuff. And we'll get to All right, so I invited these folks here because I think they all have really important things to say. So Vickii Howell here, a former newspaper reporter. So she also shares my apologies for them messing up the name of Clotilda in the 1800s. Joycelyn Davis, who is a public school teacher and a descendant of Charlie Lewis, who's the guy in the middle of the picture there, and then Darron Patterson. So I thought I might ask each of them a question to get the ball rolling, and then y'all can have it. I want to start with Joycelyn. So Joycelyn was one of the first people in Africatown I did an extensive interview with, and she really educated me a lot too. The story, so much so that she is the first voice to hear in my book. And when I turned the book in, you'll read it. If you read the book, you'll read the report. I won't go too far into it. But the editor, Simon Schuster, circled her quote, which was toward the back of the book, and said, "This is the second sentence of your book." And so, of course, she's right. And so what that sentence was about Joycelyn growing up. And so Joycelyn, you talked about as a child, even though your aunt was really one of the most prominent people celebrating the story of Africa, you were embarrassed of it, seeing it in first your textbook in fourth grade, and then in high school. And you didn't reveal to people that you were a descendant. And now you are one of the most prominent voices spreading the story of Africa and the descendants. Tell us about your personal journey and how you got there and what the story means to you. She's long, so she has time to think.
It's on the bottom.
Well,
Thank you, sir.
yeah, it was a long journey. I'm medicine, and Charlotte and Manuel. My family comes from this little small station behind the rubber company called Woods Quarter. It was established in 1870, which most of my family members deal with their state. And you've heard the story about Steve Mayor and Dr. Foster. My ancestor was not enslaved by the today. He was enslaved by Colonel Thomas, and they were on the Beaver plantation where they bought land from. And just growing up, my friends really talked about, most African Americans that I talk about Indian, no one talk about Africa. So, I grew up with the story, and some people would say, no, listen in our history, but guess who, so it took me building up to, embracing my history. Just realizing what my ancestors and knowing that he was, after who was there, he became the chief. Luther was the leader after that. Charlie O'Rourke became the leader. So it was a process for me to gain, because those enslaved Africans had a 5 years. In 5 years, they founded African, built the church, and they stayed together. Collectively, they did things together. So it took a while to get. Now it's a new record.
What about your name?
So on Woods, and some script, mostly everywhere in Mobile. She is our family historian, and she has always told that story. We would have festivals, those quarters, when she would so with that, later on, I decided to organize the festival as well. So this will be in 2023, be the 5th year of Spirit Lions. The first year we had Dr. Natalie Robertson. The second year we had Dr. Plant. The third year we had to go virtual. COVID, what we had our, speaker was Dr. Hampton, who found the last 2 surviving females. We always talk about the males, so she is the one who found Matilda and Felicia. So this past year, I decided, okay, we brought in the scholars, so how can we get the attention of the younger generation? It's called, so as you were telling the story about your journey and everything, I just picture in my mind of this story. Right, I think that play should grow and go to Shakespeare Festival, possibly Broadway, but also it needs to become a motion picture, because I feel like the children is just big as the roots and so that's what I want to start.
Good. Thank you. Good.
So let me take a brief step. First of all, we learned a lot of things from Ben Stark. I want to thank Ben for the spotlight that he has put on this story. We learned a lot from talking to Ben. One of the things we learned is that Mr. Closet broke We want to make sure that you understand how important this story is. I'm going to take a different tack than what Ben is talking about. I mean, okay. You understand what we have on our hands here? You understand it's really important that the rest of the world can learn from. Now, Ben told a story, but the only way you're going to do the real story to people who came here in that probable but naked for 2 months, eating where they prepped, okay, through 2 hurricanes. Only way you're going to really understand that is when you come to Africa Town and listen to Joycelyn's relatives tell it, and Joycelyn tell it, and me and my owner tell it. Because the only way you will know is what we learned from having the houses with these people. Now, I asked you from Mobile because from Mobile, you know Mobile. And we need to help you understand that we cannot sweep history under the rug. You don't know the name George Santayana probably, but he was a Spanish philosopher. And his greatest work was coining the phrase, he who forgets history. Mobile needs help. It needs your help. It needs our help. You understand? We cannot sweep this history on the rug. It cannot be airbrushed. It's history. It may not be pretty, but it's history. And we've got to make sure that people downtown, the people who are trying to sweep some things on the rug, in this town, in this world, critical race theory, all that stuff. Let the kids make up their own minds what they want to do. Let the kids make up their own mind about this. We are not the ones to say, you don't need to know that. You don't need to know that. We're not the ones to say, well, it's going to make the little white kids hate themselves. No, it's going to make them hate you. One thing Ben and I have in common, we both worked for the president. I was in sports and we were a few years apart. But the one thing I learned in working in sports and like Bear Bryant and folks like that is that teamwork. When you have the same color jersey on, it doesn't matter what color you are. Okay? We all have the same color jersey on. It's red, white, and blue. We've got to make sure that what we do helps my children, their grandchildren, your children, your grandchildren. We cannot airbrush this thing. We will not allow it to be airbrushed. And when we see you in Africa Town, we'll tell you a whole lot more about it. I'll tell something.
So obviously Darren does not need a question to get on.
No.
So Vickii, I want to invite you to talk a little bit about what Vickii, early on, there was talk about trying to put a museum in Africa Town that housed relics on a ship. In the early stages, they were talking about putting them in school and things. And, Vickii stood up and said, that's not big enough. And Darron said to me at one point, I credit Vickii with we were trying to cobble together what we could. And she saw we needed to reach bigger, broader. So Vickii, what was the story needs to bring the benefits, the financial, the legacy of Montgomery is $1 billion economic impact there. You always talk about how important it is to bring that to the community. So talk a little bit about
thank you, Dan. Read about us who goes to page 19. That's what we're working with the Asian representation now on cultural studios, cultural development studio. And I worked with her in Birmingham and she was with the Birmingham on the Civil Rights Heritage Program. And that's when I understood the power of civil rights and the power of class. And that's what because what's bad thing that I was working on was the economic agenda. That's what it was. So that's kind of what I was working on with some people there among that in 2013. But I decided to stay because someone said that, you know, my brother told me that maybe the thing he wanted to do in Birmingham, that's here in Mobile. So I stayed in that element for a while, the executive director of the government, and that's how I kind of went after there. Because they were having issues with, you know, the pollution and all this kind of thing. And then at that time, something was trying to bring all sorts of pipelines to the area. So the community itself has always been vibrant. It's always been fighting. They want fighting about what the vibe. And so when the event found the ship, and then after came that same month. And how do we, and we came and we had, I was also dealing with that, and I think something about, so I'm just the first time to say I'm afraid. Those are the ones who make it the way to take all the plans that they have put it together in the way. Then, and now, even before I knew anything about I knew that was the thing. African American history, you know, that's the question mark right now. Sometimes I have to wonder whether it's going to happen. I hope that I know this one for me here, so the red, white, and pink. But other people still fly the flag but you know, one of the I think no one has to be side scale that so it can't be just a little thing on the bumper that it can't be just each month. I know it doesn't happen just in there. But it's running. So why not put something there like they were saying commerce, we could do theater demo for it. So that tells the story. But it's very easy for nobody else. I talked to Mr. Delgado on Thursday. He said this is the only intact place, only intact places that have ever been found in the world.
Yes, there are 13 total, and this is the only one involved in American trade. The only one involved in American trade, and the only one that was not complete, but with a hole where the people were. So it's very unique. There's a piece of slave ship museum in DC, and it's outside of the trade from a slave ship side. Sank for 18%. So the fact that we these people, no, they're on the ship. There's nothing else.
So instead this to build have a place that's big enough. How we go from an idea to something you realize. So right now the land still over, but then they would have to be one ultimate what happened to that. But the idea of we didn't have really shown what could be there, place to look. That might inspire people to want to pursue the museum. Not only that, I'm concerned about, I said, I really talk about our organization, M.O.V.E Gulf Coast CDC for everyone. That was kind of the Birmingham was talk that was really came up with that reporting. Very supportive. And their own ideas that have all been against. So the community had a neighborhood, and also the some time of the mayor the garden is also there's a piece of art that was sent by a group of I went to after myself in 2018, and I heard people were trying to reconnect and with also people here. They commissioned a piece of artwork that's now sitting downtown called region because they want to reconnect with the folks they stole in slavery. There's a deep shame about this. Also, keep connecting, keep that right. And so some of the people who said that were not only connected to the king of the home, some of those people who said that are also Europe. So there is a reconnection with their community. So there's some related for the one so just not just museums, but also there's a school that's there, there's need for affordable housing, for, so I you help us figure out how to take all these plans and make them feel and look seamless as much as we have a tourism destination system that allows multiple places. And when they spend their money, the tax dollars can be taxed at a certain way, but those dollars can then be put back to fund those organizations like the Conservation Foundation, the ECC, all the different organizations that have been working, so this way now comes back to generate more opportunities for the people who create out there, the signs that are working, the t-shirts, someone's gonna live in a house, we want to put everyone to their house, so somebody's gonna people rent the house, so those kind of things. So the money becomes a generative process, so those back to what he was saying, that we as Americans, for collective time, we said, collective African Americans, economy that was the ninth of the world. So he was really about, he was not really about integration the way we can talk about integration, he was about how do we have our part of the class? We don't have to share it with everybody. This is truly uniquely an African American story. My mother said, when she passed, yeah, this is people story. They were on a ship, but like they said, and people who even over there, it has to be a record. So we talk about reconciliation. Reconciliation means that two sides that war together. How do we do that? You know, the daily return is nice, but that really feel avoid the pain. How can you do that? So there's going to be some processes about how we create change to truly reconcile the brain society. Especially some of the people may feel a little bit about it. Reconciliation is such a thing. We're all going to change everything in school. No, reconciliation is about more than take things right. It's not creating systemic changes. Yeah. And so in this, I look at what happened with Buffalo and shooting there. When you talk about reconciliation, right? We used to have Taiwan, but now technically do that today. I read articles from Architectural Magazine will say, how safe I mean, if you actually pull the hotel about the water communities museums, can we have a African American community and people can go by it and worry about somebody's research. So as a community and as a country and as a people as humanity, we have to really grapple with what it means to show love. Love is not just the word, reconciliation is not just the word, it means something. So we have an opportunity to use this story in a lot of ways. And also one of the things that the people in the meeting, especially Bonte, they want to send their petition. Whole story. So yeah.
It's really important for you not to walk out of this room the way you came in. My pastor says that all the time. Don't walk out of here like you came. Ben told the story and put a highlight and a spotlight on the story. Now what do? Okay, I'm always big on what we do now. Okay, don't walk out of this room like you came in here. And for your friends and for their friends to understand what we have on our hands. M.O.V.E. I grew up here. I understand M.O.V.E. I grew up with three traditional form of government. I know that there was underrepresentation for people of color at this time. I know what it's like to live in a situation like this, and somebody says, okay, Darron, here's what we're going to do. No, why don't you ask me what is going to happen? Don't just come and tell me. And Ben talk about this all the time. It's really important that we be very careful how we approach things in M.O.V.E. because for so long, people in M.O.V.E. came to us. We're going to put a 4-lane highway through African time. I cut off some cemetery. I end up with some houses done. Wait, why didn't you ask me this beforehand? Okay? So what I'm saying to you is, in this room, please, okay, this is too important for you to walk out of here and not understand what those people in the Chicago will meant to this community. They were remarkable people. I'm so proud to have pulled me out of this building through my thank you. You understand me? Please, walk out of here.
May I say something? What you just said to all of us, we needed badly to hear. And we need to tell this story everywhere we go. We need to buy many copies of your book and give to our friends. And your book ought to be made into a film, no question about it. It ought to be made into a film. Absolutely. But my word to you is this: persevere, persevere, persevere. You've come this far, keep going, keep telling this story. Every opportunity you have to speak, do so, and then create opportunities. Don't wait just for an invitation. Create opportunities to tell the story that we have heard today, because everyone in this city needs to hear it. Everyone in this state and our country. The truth of the matter is, and I know you all know this extremely well, but the world is hearing this story of Clotilda, and they're calling people in Mobile now, asking all kinds of questions about Clotilda. So I'm saying to you, on behalf of everyone in here, thank you, thank you, thank you, and persevere.
So, I am not from Alabama. I'm originally from New Orleans, and it's great to be restored. I'm also a pastor, and you guys were kind of talking the thoughts of David wanted to build a temple, but he couldn't. But he started preserving and getting ready to Solomon to build a temple. Now, I don't know where you guys are at in the process, but what are you doing to preserve the history, especially for those that are in their elder years, their 70s and 80s, kind of getting some of that? And then if the French are looking to give back some of the art, to preserving some of those things and preserving some of those precious treasures, because truth is treasure. And that's the reason why people don't want it. If it gets torn down by the truth, tear it down. So what are you guys doing to kind of preserve their stories, preserve this truth, preserve these resources? Because if it can't happen now, Solomon might do it. It's going to be this crazy generation that's going to say, you know what, I made my millions in this arena. Now I can turn it into health, that arena.
I don't know how much time you have. But I'm glad you identified yourself. Please do. We are doing so much. There's a lot going on. I mean, I can't even begin to tell you from the whole histories we are documenting to a museum, temporary museum, heritage house that's going to open probably in the fall, to an ocean in my bones. You need to see this. The one I played at the Spirit of Our Ancestors Festival, which Joycelyn is the brainchild, the Spirit of Our Ancestors Festival. We're going to hear words seen like a Mind Community Theater, Terrence Spivey's great director. We're going to have the full-length stage play ready to go in 2024. We are our goal is to make sure that the world understands. See, we're already at the point right now, whole world. People who've been oppressed for so long, say, we're not this no more. It's happening in Australia, it's happening in South America, it's happening everywhere. And whose better voice to be at the forefront of that discussion about oppression than the descendants of the Clotilda? What about us? We know about oppression, man. Let's talk to us. So we'll talk afterwards. I can give you more, and you can also go to theclotildastory.com. Okay, it's also a huge domain button there. It'll tell you a whole lot, and the contact us button on there comes regularly to us and that, and we can tell you more about what's going on. Jesus, there's just so much happening. So many people are jumping on this plane. This genie is not about, the plane is just a station. Any other metaphors I can think of, it's gone, and it can't come back. So the people who are the trackers get on board with us because we're rolling, man. Right?
We have. He's on the webinar here, and he asked, will the be in place?
Mike Foster, get off the phone. Yes, yes. Yes, Mike Foster. Right now, the door return is in person. It just got put up. So, but people who sent it, they connected to Jim team. We're working on their pieces and right now, but I can rest assured that they're whatever design that you want to need. They'll be open to that. I just want to say real quickly that that's for me. After you wanted to keep an update on what's happening with the African design, I did competition with the Warrior 16 sites on the tourism system. Go to Africatown, www.africatowndesign.com. Africatowndesign.com. At the bottom, there's update page. You sign in there, you'll see some updates on what's going on. That's what I'm glad to want to say is the jurors, especially African jurors, are part of this. We're let the world know that we want Afrocentric design. They're saying this is the biggest, blackest design competition in the world. They said, maybe what this is up here. But people around the world are very excited about this. So we want to encourage these designers to make the best ideas. The research deadline is 19. He's not, yes.
I want to in the whole process of developing the I'm thoroughly afraid that we're going to get caught unprepared, not ready. We talk about all the big things. But where's they? Why aren't they here talking with us about street houses? You want to have people come to the whole world. So I want to know, where are they?
The mayor, they have shown support. We would like more. We have to have more. You've ever gone to Joycelyn lately in Savannah? That's what Mobile's going to look like. People are coming to these places. Montgomery, Alabama, the bastion in the civil rights places, you can't step off the curb. It's like you hit by a tour bus now. So now we want these representatives of ours to see the potential. In my heart, I believe they see it. What comes next is up to them. No. What I'm saying is what comes next. What I'm saying is what comes next in terms of their leadership and what they display. We can be Savannah, we can be y'all. Okay?
Is Mobile, Alabama.
Absolutely.
I want for how long they have the free go there, march here, and people leave and go to Montgomery.
So what are we going to pull people and why aren't we embracing what we need to do? I don't know. But
Maybe understand.
based on the responsible for they have not start doing this way in that way. That's all.
Stan, I think you just told them.
Can we contact our councilman? Is that the first step to it? And really just explode, find out who your councilman is, get their phone number, get their email, and just explode demanding something gets done.
Thank you all so very much for coming. I am so happy that we had this program, and it seems like you all are on fire for supporting the African town. I'd like to thank our speaker and our panel who have done an excellent job, and I think you have shown some interest in, we get thank you enough for attending today. I am not here to, well, first of all, enjoy the reception and the wonderful job as books for sale. Thank you so very much.